Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to be talking about blade sharpness. What are the characteristics of a knife that create a really sharp blade and how you can achieve that? And it's a really scientific and mystifying kind of conversation. However, I have the ability to boil that down into very simple terms that you can understand because I am the super knife guy and I have sophisticated training devices that'll help you to understand what it is I'm really talking about. So if you'd like to see more about what causes a knife to be sharp, how it is achieved, and understand it, go ahead and check out the video. All right, welcome back to the Fortified Castle. Hi to all my viewers. Bonjour, privet, guten tag, hola, ciao, and konnichiwa to my foreign viewers. And today we're going to be talking about what makes a sharp edge on a knife. How do they achieve that? And what do you need to look for to have a sharp knife? Before we get into that, one of my viewers had a simple question. Why didn't more knife shows talk about blade sharpness? So I believe they do. I believe most guys talk about blade sharpness, but there's a point where it doesn't really matter what you're talking about. I'm a vintage guy. A lot of my content is vintage knives, and when you talk about knives like these, 50 plus years old, it really doesn't matter whether you're talking about the sharpness of the blade or not. You have to realize that these blades are not brand new. They're in rough shape. So are the knives. Oftentimes you have to clean them up and just do some work on them. Matter of fact, that's how Knife Doctors presents his show. He takes old beat up knives and he restores and puts new life into them. So it doesn't really matter on vintage knives. Now, when you get to a modern folder, then yeah, I think most guys talk about the sharpness and edge of a blade. I certainly do. I don't always do it, but it just kind of depends on what I'm doing. Like a lot of times I'm just showing a knife, I'm not reviewing it. And so if I'm reviewing a knife, I'm going to definitely tell you whether it's sharp or not. It makes a difference because some guys don't want to buy a knife that's not sharp. They're not good at sharpening knives, so they want their knives to be sharp when they get them and have a good edge. The other thing I mention usually is the consistency of the edge, and that's important because that impacts your ability to resharpen that knife. And so that's the deal with content providers. It just kind of depends on what you're doing. Sometimes I'm just showing a knife and I don't talk about the blade at all because I'm not doing a review on it. All right, so let's get into this blade sharpness and what it's all about. So blade sharpness really boils down to this, guys. It's sharpness equals the angle of the edge. The less of an angle you have, the more acute that angle is, the sharper the edge is going to be. That's pretty much the bottom line. Surprisingly, it is not so much about steels, right? And why is that? So definitely, some steels can have the characteristics that provide a very sharp edge. But what I'm trying to say is you can have two 420 steels, for instance. And on one of those steels, the knife can get a really sharp edge, and on another one, another type of knife, the edge might not get so sharp. So what is the difference between that? It's the same steel. And even if you go higher up into a range of super steel, you may not get a particularly sharp edge. One of the things it has to do with is angle. I think that's the most important factor in determining how sharp a knife really gets. And that's why we use these, right? It's a totally different knife for cutlery. We use special knives that have a very thin edge on them, and it makes them very sharp. And that's what we use in cutlery, and it has to do with the angle on the edge. And so I'm not completely ruling out steel, but this is what I'm trying to say right here. So this is a magnification of carbides. What are carbides? Carbides are little tiny molecules, atoms of carbon in a blade. And upon the best resolution, this is what you can see. And little tiny carbides that are evenly dispersed up on the edge of the blade make a really sharp blade. So that doesn't really have anything to do whether the steel is AEBL or S30V or 1095. It has to do with how those carbides are dispersed in the steel, and that has more to do with heat treatments and tempering of the steel than actually the steel itself. And the reverse of that is a steel that has large carbides. So what happens here is you get tiny carbides like up above, but also you have bigger carbides, and that occurs when the carbons mix with the alloys in the steel. Chromium is a really good, a real big villain in this, right? So carbides will stick to chromium really easy, bond with them, and form bigger carbides of steel or specks of steel inside of the steel. And when you have this irregularity of small carbons and you have the big carbons spaced out, the steel doesn't get as sharp. So does that mean it's dull? No, it doesn't mean it's dull. It just means it won't get as razor sharp as some steels get. And you can most steels you can get a pretty good working edge on. Again, if they're heat treated properly and they're tempered properly. So it's not really the steel, it's how the steel is made. And there are some steels, for instance, like stainless steels, traditionally, don't sharpen real well because they tend to mix with the carbon. They have a lot of chromium in them. And so you don't get superior sharpness out of that steel. But people have come up with creative heat treatments and I'm sorry, had brain freeze, and temperings so that, it works. A good example of that is the Boss heat treatment on Box 420HC steel. It's phenomenal, and it creates a great steel and a great sharp edge that you can repeat. And it's not a high-end steel. It's just an old normal steel, but it's how they heat treat it. So next thing I want to show you is we're going to talk about the edge a little bit. So if this is the thickness of your stock right here, right there, materials removed down away from the knife. You can see it's cut out here, and that creates the edge of your knife. So the apex here is the very top of the edge of the knife. That's what this represents right here. Your edge is created by removing material here down to this edge. This doesn't mean a whole lot here, the angles, but I thought I'd talk about it because it can be confusing. So you hear a lot of guys talking about 18-degree edge or a 21 degree edge, and you hear guys saying, I've got this 21 degree edge, but I'm going to take it down to 18 because I just like it better. And what are they talking about? And so that degree that they're talking about is the inside angle from the edge here, the angle that's actually produced from the edge. They're not talking about this angle that is created from the outside of the knife. So if you wanted a 11 degree edge, and that's the distance from one side to the other, here, the angle that's created, you have a degree here towards your edge to 5.5 and 5.5 on the other side, which makes 11 degrees. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about the inside angle of your edge that's created. That's important if you're sharpening and you don't understand that. And I'll point that out later when we're talking about sharpening of a knife. Most knives have a secondary bevel. Oh, what is that? Okay, so on a knife, when they take the stock down to create the edge, this is the primary bevel of a knife. It's called a bevel or a grind. We often, just call it a grind, but it's a primary bevel. It's possible to create an edge off this primary bevel, but it's a lot easier if you put a secondary bevel on there. And if you, let me try to get this in for you. All right, there you can see the secondary bevel. So this is a primary coming down, and then this silver part is the secondary bevel, which creates your edge right there. And that's what a secondary bevel is. Most knife companies sharpen edges with a secondary bevel nowadays. And that'll come into play here in a minute when we talk about the thickness of an edge. All right. So if you imagine this is the edge of the knife magnified, and this fuzzy part is the secondary bevel, what's really important is that you have a consistency in this area of the secondary bevel. In other words, both sides of this secondary bevel should be equal. It's common sense, so that you can have a keen, sharp edge. Okay, so what we're talking about is, let me get it in here. Okay, you could see the edge. So we're going down here and you can see this is very consistent, meaning from where the secondary bevel starts to the edge, it's very consistent on this knife. This is a ZT. They did a great job. It widens just a hair here towards the end, but it's really consistent, amazingly so. A lot of times on the edges, you'll see this flare out, the edge flare out, and that's caused by when they flick the knife like that to sharpen it. If you look at the other side of this knife, you'll see again, let me get it in for you. There you go. You'll see again that it's very consistent across here. And it's a little less wide than the other side if you look at the other side again, but they're pretty close. You see that? They are pretty close. You can see that. This side is a little smaller right here, the one we're looking at right now. So that's pretty good consistency, and that'll help you have a really sharp edge and a repeatable edge that you can resharpen again and again. When you get to knives, the opposite of that is a knife like this. So this is a Ross knife right here. If you, let me try to find it. Good shot. Okay, there is the secondary bevel. You can see it's a little thin here, and as we go out, it gets thicker. See that? And then it thins right here where my thumb is. Oh, okay. Trying to get this in for you guys. That light is blinding me. Okay, it gets a little thin right here, and then it starts flaring out again. And you can see how bad it flares out right there. So I'm going to zoom in here, and we'll look at it. This is the other side. So on the other side, you can see it's not as wide as the side we just looked at. You can see it's fairly consistent there, but it widens right there, and then it widens here at the edge. So it's not, this knife is not consistent within its own bevel. You can see where that gets skinnier right there, and it's not consistent with the other side. And so let me get this in. So you have that right there. When you flip it over, let me get it in, you see how much smaller it is. Okay, so that is a problem for you, because if you look at this diagram right here, this is your edge. Imagine that the bevel that we looked at is this bevel. So on the one side, the left side that we looked at, the bevel was a lot thinner, and on the other side that we looked at, it was a lot wider and longer, and it creates this kind of edge. The problem with that, let me zoom back to reality here. The problem with that is it makes this side stronger, and what's going to happen, first, it's going to be hard to sharpen this, but once you use this knife, it's going to tend to round over to the thinner side. If this side was thinner, it'd round this way. It doesn't matter which way, it's going to round to the thinner side. And once it rounds over, it's going to be really hard to sharpen again, because the edge is not formed properly. Basically, that's what we're saying. So imagine, this is your edge right here, and this is what we're talking about, and the edges don't meet, so sharpening that to a fine edge is going to be hard because they don't match up. And then when you use it, it's going to tend to roll over, and then you're really going to have a problem getting it sharp at that point. So that's why edge consistency is really important. Another thing you'll notice here is the different angles. So on this one, you have a wide angle, right? And in this one, a much thinner. So if you just apply any number, it doesn't matter to this. Say this is a 20-degree angle right here, and this is a 10-degree angle. You can see why one is going to be sharper. It's going to be thinner right there than this one right here. And that's basically the idea behind the different edge geometries that you get on a knife. So most knife manufacturers are putting a 21-degree edge geometry on their knives now, somewhere in there. This is a little Kershaw Mini XL, or a Mini, what the heck is this? My mind is not working. A Mini Natrix, that's what this is called, and it has a 21-degree edge angle on it. So that's not horrendous. Traditionally, knives only had 3. So when I was growing up back in the 20th century, you had 10 degrees, which was kitchen cutlery. You had around 23 degrees, which was your EDC type knives, like buck knives. And then on your hunting knives, they were 45 degrees, okay? So they had a very, very sharp edge like that. And they did that because it provided a lot of strength. So the wider these degrees are, the stronger the edge is going to be. It's going to resist chipping. As you narrow that angle, the edge becomes more and more delicate, and it'll chip easily. And so in the kitchen, an 11-degree edge in the kitchen provides for a very sharp knife. You notice these cleavers you use just cut through anything, meat, beef, chicken, pork, it doesn't matter what it is. It's because of that very shallow 11-degree edge that they put on these things. These knives cut good, but they're just not quite as slicey as a kitchen knife, and it's because of the thin edge that they have. And so that's the difference that these edge angles make. So why don't you take your hunting knife and put a 10-degree edge on it? Well, it boils down to strength. So if you were to put a 10-degree edge on this knife, which you certainly could do, it would have a really wide secondary bevel but the edge would be very delicate. And these type of knives, you're out there chopping wood, you're chopping on the ground, it hits stones, and you don't want that thin, vulnerable edge on a hunting knife. Now, with better steels, better heat treatments, and just better um, uh, blade production in general, they have narrowed this down to like 23 to 25 degrees. So manufacturers are putting a much smaller angle on these hunting knives because of better steel. They can do it. But that's what we're talking about when you want to create a smaller angle on your knife. Go from 21 degrees down to 18. You can see what's happening. You're getting a thinner blade profile that cuts better, which translates into sharpness to us, how we perceive it. And so if you look at this knife here, there's another thing here that I'm just going to show you because it doesn't matter a whole lot, I don't think, but you'll hear the term, and that's blade behind the edge. And what they're talking about is the thickness of the blade behind this edge that you're creating. And so the less blade behind the edge you have here, like on this edge right here, if you have less blade behind the edge, it's going to be more slicey, easier to cut through something, and it's going to be a sharper knife. And those type of knives, so I'm going to give an example of that. On a bigger, heavy-duty user knife like this ZT, you have a really thick stock. You don't need a stock this thick, but it's okay. I like it. It's a thick stock, but the blade behind the edge on this knife is 33 thousandths. It's pretty thick. Okay, pretty thick in knife terms nowadays. But it's been a very consistent edge, so I've used this a lot in EDC, and I haven't damaged the edge on this knife. This Adamas is another big bruising of a knife, and it has a 34-degree edge behind. Whether they intended that or not, that's what's the blade behind the edge on this knife, which you're talking about the amount of steel where that secondary bevel starts. That is 34 thousandths of an inch. It's pretty thick. This is another big knife. It's another Kershaw. Very similar blade geometry as the other two, and it's around 32. It's a little thinner than the other knives. And, it creates a stronger edge for heavy duty use. When you get down to this, the blade behind this edge is 24 thousandths. So, again, you're talking about that steel right at that transition there before you get into your edge. That right there is 24 thousandths. That's not super for a super slicey blade, but it's probably about average nowadays in EDC knives, right around there, 2 thousandths, 24 thousandths, 18 thousandths. This knife right here is made to be a really slicey knife, right? That's the geometry of the blade. That's the geometry of the knife. You can see a very deep hollow grind on this knife. And the blade behind the edge of this knife is 18 thousandths. So it's really slicey. And you'll hear reviewers who are really into this kind of thing and talk about it a lot, talk about knives they're down to a thousandths behind the edge being super slicey. And pardon me, that's what causes it, is the actual blade profile right there. All right, so what does that all mean? We talked about the most important thing that creates a sharp edge is this angle on the edge. The more acute it is, if you go down to 10 degrees, it's going to be sharper. If it's 21 degrees, it's going to be okay sharp, and you can get it really sharp, but it's not going to slice as good as the one that's only 11 degrees. And if it's really thick at 45 degrees, it's going to have a super powerful edge that's not going to chip very easily, but it's not going to be as slicey, and it's not going to be as sharp as you can get these little thin blades. The other thing, the carbides is really important. That has to do with maximizing the type of steel that you're using and making sure that those carbides stay free, like they're all carbon, and that they don't get tied up in other alloys like chromium or molybdenum or other things like that. The freer the carbon stays and the more equally it's distributed, you're going to have a much sharper, better edge. Those are the main factors in blade sharpness. So real quick, if you're sharpening a blade, so this is a guide that I have for my sander, and all I got to do is put it on 18, and I take it and put it on my sander. So the sandpaper would be right here. You can see where it's worn it, and I put it on the angle, and I just slide it across, and I get a perfect 18-degree edge on my knife using this. If you're using a stone, like a work sharp, you'll notice this, but a lot of these stones nowadays have this same feature. It's this angle right here, and what that angle is angle set for a 21 degree edge, and you just put your blade on that angle and let your knife hit that angle and your edge hit, and then you sharpen down, maintaining that angle, and it's kind of worry free to get a good edge. If you're not good at maintaining a constant edge as you're sharpening. So those are little helps. A lot of professional knife makers, custom knife makers make jigs, and so they'll make a jig like this to put on their sander, and it's the same thing, and you can do the same thing. You can also make little jigs like this where you create your angle, you put your knife on there, and then touch your stone. You use the jig to maintain the angle for you. And these are really simple to make. You just make them to the angle that you want to make them, and it produces a really good edge on your knife. So anyhow, I hope you understood all of that. I hope I was able to simplify it. It is really simple. It all boils down to the angle. Narrow angle, really sharp. Bigger angle, not as sharp. And some steel mechanics come into it, like the carbides. And how do you know whether you have a knife that has good carbide distribution, whether it's evenly distributed, and whether it's fine carbide? You don't. When you're going to tell that is when you sharpen your knife. Okay, so when you sharpen a knife and you just can't get that knife sharp, the heat treatment on it's, the tempering on it's wrong, or the carbides just aren't there. And that's what I was saying before. You can have two of the same steels and they can perform completely differently because one manufacturer has taken the effort to make sure that the carbides in the steel stay fine grain carbides, and the other manufacturer didn't really take that much care in doing that. And that's how you can get two different steels that perform vastly different. So I hope you found that informative. I tried to keep it short. It's just hard to keep this short. So thanks again, guys, and have a great day.